I'm going to begin at the sort of in the middle of the second Christian century. So we're talking 120 years after Jesus was dead. 120 years later, when we have some pretty good evidence about what some Christians were thinking about this particular issue. I'm going to begin with a group of Christians called the Marcionites. They were called the Marcionites because they were followers of a particular theologian, philosopher, whose name just happened to be Marcion. Marcion. The Marcionites were a very interesting and distinctive group because Marcion himself had a very distinctive and interesting teaching. Marcion was particularly obsessed with the Apostle Paul and the writings of the Apostle Paul. Now, the Apostle Paul taught that Christ had saved people by his death and his resurrection. And Paul differentiated between the gospel of Christ, which brings salvation, and the law of the Jews that brings condemnation. This is, my students resonate with this. So Paul, the law of the Jews brings condemnation, the gospel of Christ brings salvation. Paul differentiated between the law and the gospel, and Marcion took very close note of that. Marcion maintained that the God who gave the law cannot be the same God who brought salvation. The God of the Hebrew Bible, of what Christians would call the Old Testament God is actually a different God from the God of Jesus. Marcion wrote a book called The Antitheses, the contrary statements, where he tried to show that the God of the Old Testament is not the God of the New Testament. So, for example, he points out that in the Old Testament, the God of the Old Testament tells the children of Israel they're supposed to take the promised land. Well, the problem is somebody already lives in the promised land. So how are we supposed to have the promised land? Well, you've got to kill the people who are in there. Really? Yes. So, Joshua chapter 6, God commands the troops under Joshua to go in and take the city of Jericho. You know the story. They're supposed to march around the city once a day for 6 days. Seventh day, they march around 7 times. They blow the trumpets, they shout, and the walls will come tumbling down, and it happens. And God says, go into the city and murder every man, woman, and child in the city. Marcion tells the story, and then he says, is this the same God that says, love your enemy? If somebody persecutes you, pray for them. If somebody slaps you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. No, that's not the same God. They're different gods. You've got a wrathful God in the Old Testament, and you've got a merciful God in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you have the prophet Elisha, a man of God, who's walking by a group of boys. And these boys start making fun of him. He's going bald. And so they call out, Baldy, Baldy. And Elisha calls the wrath of God down. And 2 she-bears come out of the woods and maul 42 of them to death. Is this the same God who says, let the little children come unto me? No, it's not the same God. It's a different God. Marcion literally thought there were 2 gods. Literally thought there were 2 gods. The God of the Old Testament was the God who created this world and chose Israel and gave them the law, and the God of Jesus is the God who saves people from that God. They're 2 separate gods. Jesus does not belong to the Creator God. Jesus wasn't even a material being in this world, because if Jesus had been born of the union of Joseph and Mary and been born like everybody else, he'd be a creature like everybody else, which would mean he'd belong to the Creator like everyone else. So Jesus was never born. Jesus descended from heaven as a full-grown man and wasn't really a fleshly human being because he didn't belong to the Creator. Why didn't Marcion simply read the New Testament to realize it wasn't that way? There wasn't a New Testament. It didn't exist yet. Of course, the books that later were put into the New Testament existed, but there wasn't a canon of Scripture yet. Marcion may well have been the first Christian to devise a canon. He had something like our Gospel of Luke, and he had something like 10 of our letters of Paul, and that was it. His Bible didn't have 66 books in it the way the Christian Bible typically has. He had 11 books. No Old Testament. That's the book for the Jews. Well, whatever you think of that, it's a rather elegant solution about what to do about the relationship of the Old Testament and the New Testament. You simply get rid of the Old Testament.